You're listening to European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on CO2 emissions in the aviation sector.
CO2 emissions from aviation have been part of the EU emissions trading system since 2012. But the EU decided to stop the clock and limit the scope of the scheme to flights within the European Economic Area until the end of 2016 to give the International Civil Aviation Organization time to develop global measures.
The Commission wants now to prolong the derogation for flights outside the European Economic Area, but are the Parliament and Member States prepared to go along with this? Stay with us.
Did you know that someone flying from London to New York and back generates roughly the same level of emissions as the average person in the EU does by heating their home for a whole year?
Yes, you heard right. Direct emissions from aviation account for about 3% of the EU's total greenhouse gas emissions and more than 2% of global emissions. So if global aviation was a country, it would rank among the top 10 emitters.
And unless we do something about it, the problem is likely to get worse. With anticipated growth in air traffic, emissions in 2050 are expected to be 7 to 10 times higher than 1990 levels.
So what is the EU doing about this?
The EU has taken big steps to reduce its own aviation emissions and is working with the international community to develop global measures. For instance, CO2 emissions from aviation have been included in the EU emissions trading system since 2012.
Under this scheme, all airlines operating in Europe are required to monitor, report and verify their emissions and to surrender allowances against those emissions, and they receive tradable allowances covering a certain level of emissions from their flights every year.
But the EU decided to limit the scope of the emissions trading system to flights within the European Economic Area until the end of 2016 to support the development of global measures by the International Civil Aviation Organization. So how much progress has been made?
In October 2016, the International Civil Aviation Organization agreed to establish a global market-based measure to address CO2 emissions from international aviation as of 2021.
The Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, or CORSIA, will require airlines to monitor, report and offset CO2 emissions from international civil aviation above 2020 levels.
It will apply only to international flights, not to domestic ones, and participation will be voluntary during the pilot and first phase, so from 2021 to 2026, and will become mandatory for all states as of 2027.
65 countries, including the EU's 28, have already said they will join from the start. But how does this global scheme compare to the EU's emissions trading system?
Well, it's a bit different. Contrary to the emissions trading system, which is a cap and trade scheme that sets an upper limit for the total amounts of emissions, CORSIA is an offsetting scheme. Now, what does that mean?
It means that emissions can grow, but they must be compensated for by offsets. So from 2020, any increase in airline CO2 emissions will be offset by activities like tree planting to soak up CO2.
So work is ongoing at the International Civil Aviation Organization to develop the necessary implementation tools and measures to start collecting emissions data in 2019 and make the scheme operational in 2021.
The Commission strongly supports the adoption of this global scheme, and in February 2017 it proposed to continue stopping the clock for flights outside the European Economic Area until we have a better idea of how the proposed global market-based measure is being implemented. But in any case, flights within the EU will continue to be covered by the emissions trading system.
The Commission is also proposing to gradually reduce the number of aviation allowances from 2021 onwards. But what do stakeholders have to say about that? Let's begin with the Parliament.
In its first reading position on emissions trading system reform, MEPs agreed on the need to reduce the number of aviation allowances and to use auction revenues to support climate action in the EU and third countries.
MEPs have also welcomed the International Civil Aviation Organization's plans and the commitment of 65 countries to join voluntarily from the start, but there are some doubts as to whether the global measure will live up to expectations.
While airlines have generally welcomed the deal and even see it as an opportunity to scrap the emissions trading system completely, environmental organisations are disappointed by its lack of ambition. So what can we expect?
Well, the Commission's proposal has been referred to the Parliament's Environment Committee, and there's pressure for the Parliament and Council to reach an agreement before the end of 2017.
If that doesn't happen, airlines would have to report their 2017 emissions from flights outside the European Economic Area and surrender emission allowances in March and April 2018.
We'll be following the debate. You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.